A werewolf romance story by the Alpha's Claim Collection. Prologue. The poison didn't kill me, but watching him sign my death warrant with a smile that did something no venom ever could. I want you to understand something before the story begins. I was not a fool. I was not a naive girl who stumbled into a king's bed and confused convenience for love. I was a woman who asked the right questions, read every warning sign, and chose to believe anyway. Because sometimes the heart makes calculations the mind can't argue with. Sometimes you look at a person in an unguarded moment, really look at them, past the crown, past the title, past every wall they've spent a lifetime constructing, and you see something so achingly real that walking away becomes physically impossible. That was Dorian Voss to me. My king. My secret. My catastrophic mistake. For 2 years I wore his mark beneath my sleeve and his name in the locked chamber of my chest where no one else was allowed to go. For 2 years I served wine at his banquets and kept my eyes respectfully down and pretended I didn't know the exact sound he made when he laughed at something that genuinely surprised him. For 2 years we existed in the stolen spaces between his public life and whatever truth lived underneath it. I thought I was the only one who knew that truth. I was wrong about that. I was wrong about several things. But I was not wrong about the mark. The mark does not lie. And the mark was the first thing that understood, before I did, before he did, before anyone in that gleaming palace with its politics and its poisoned alliances and its careful cruelties. The mark understood that something was coming that would crack the world open and change every single thing inside it. My name is Lena Ashford. I was a servant. Then I was a secret wife. Then I was a woman running through darkness with nothing but a burning mark on her arm and a life growing quiet and stubborn inside her body. And then I became something the world hadn't seen in 800 years. This is where it starts. But before we dive into today's story, I have to ask, where in the world are you listening from right now? Drop your location and the time in the comments below. Is it a quiet early morning in Melbourne? Afternoon in Canada? A cozy evening in Sydney? Or a late night in Los Angeles? There is something truly magical about knowing that wolves from every corner of the globe are gathered here together for the same story. This is the tale of Lena Ashford, a woman who spent 2 years as her Alpha King's secret wife, hidden from the world, loving a man who wore another face in public while she carried the mark of their binding beneath her sleeve. The night he announced his engagement to another woman, Lena discovered she was carrying something far more dangerous than a secret. She was carrying his heir. An heir with the power to reshape the entire wolf world. Threatened, hunted, and left with nowhere to turn, she vanished into the cursed Thornwood forest, the place every wolf was taught to fear from birth. What she found inside it was not death. It was the truth of who she had always been. And the awakening of a bloodline 800 years in the making. If you are ready for a story of hidden love, devastating betrayal, an ancient power rising in the most unlikely vessel, and a mother who would burn the world before letting anyone touch her child, then hit that like button right now and subscribe to the Alpha's Claim Collection so you never miss a story like this one. Tell me where you are listening from in the comments. Let's see just how wide our paranormal romance family really stretches. Alright, let's begin. Chapter 1, The Announcement. The goblet slipped in my hand when I first saw her. I caught it before a single drop fell. Years of service train reflexes the way fear trains survival, but my heart lurched sideways in my chest and took a moment to find its footing again. Lady Cashin Cross had arrived in the great hall like a season changing. Not loudly. Not with fanfare. Simply with the particular confidence of someone who has already decided how the evening ends and is merely waiting for everyone else to catch up. She was beautiful. Of course she was. Tall and proud with copper hair swept into an arrangement that probably cost more than my monthly wage, and a gown the color of winter ice that caught the candlelight and threw it back like a challenge. She moved through the crowd the way alpha-born women move. Not parting it, but expecting it to part and being consistently correct. I had seen women like her my entire life in this palace. I had served them wine and kept my eyes down and felt absolutely nothing. That night, Watching her cross the room toward the raised dais where Dorian stood, I felt everything. I positioned myself near the eastern pillar. The one I always chose when I needed to be invisible, close enough to serve if summoned, far enough from the central light to exist mostly as shadow. My uniform was pressed. My hair was pinned back correctly. My face was exactly what it had been trained to be: pleasant, neutral, present without being intrusive. Inside, I was calculating. She had arrived with 6 members of her family's household, 3 senior advisors I recognized from diplomatic correspondence, and 2 wolves whose bearing and body language screamed private security rather than ceremonial guard. She had not come for a dinner. She had come for a transaction. My mark burned. Faintly, just a whisper of heat against the inside of my forearm where the crescent had lived for 2 years, always warm, always there, like a second pulse I'd learned to ignore in public. But that night it flickered the way a candle flickers when a door opens somewhere distant, responding to something it recognized, something approaching. I pressed my arm against my side and made myself breathe. Dorian entered from the north corridor. I had watched him walk into rooms 1,000 times. I knew the precise architecture of how he held himself in public. The measured stride, the weight of authority settled across his shoulders like a physical thing, the careful neutrality of his expression that I alone knew was not coldness, but concentration. He was always thinking 3 conversations ahead. Always watching. Always managing the gap between what was said and what was meant. That night he looked tired in a way that had nothing to do with sleep. He took his position at the head of the dais, and the room organized itself around him the way rooms always did in his presence. Conversations died to murmurs. Murmurs died to attention. For 100 wolves with their pack politics and their alliance calculations and their careful social performances all turned their faces toward their king and waited. Dorian's eyes swept the room. They found mine. 1 second. Less than 1 second, the duration of a breath held and released. Something moved through his expression that I had no name for. Something complicated and shadowed that I had never seen there before. His jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Then his gaze moved on. And I understood, with the particular clarity that only arrives in the worst moments, that whatever was about to happen, he had known it was coming. He had known and had not warned me. He began to speak. The formal address was standard. I had transcribed enough of them to could recite the opening structure in my sleep. Pack prosperity. Alliance strength. The responsibilities of leadership in uncertain times. My attention snagged on the words without fully processing them because my mark was no longer flickering. It was burning. A steady, escalating heat that I had never felt before, climbing up my forearm toward my elbow, branching outward like something waking up. I pressed harder against the pillar. "It is with great pride," Dorian said, and his voice was steady, certain, the voice he used when there was no room for questions, that I announced the formal engagement between the House of Voss and the House of Cross. The room erupted. Cheering. Genuine, relieved, political cheering, the sound of 400 wolves exhaling a tension they'd been carrying for months. Alliance secured. Future assured. The king had chosen well and wisely, and the pack would prosper, and everything was exactly as it should be. I did not hear any of it. I heard the blood moving through my own ears. I heard the soft, involuntary sound that escaped my mouth before I could stop it, barely a breath, not even a word, swallowed immediately and completely. I heard the creak of the pillar against my shoulder as my weight shifted into it. Lady Cassioncross stepped forward and took Dorian's hand. She turned to face the crowd with the smile of someone who has waited patiently for something they were always certain they would receive. And then, only then, her eyes found mine in the shadows. Her smile did not widen. It did not change at all. That was the worst part. There was no triumph in it. No cruelty. Just a calm, complete recognition. As if she had known exactly where I was standing. As if she had looked for me specifically. As if she wanted me to know that she knew. The mark exploded. I do not have a better word for it. One moment it was burning heat. The next, white-hot pain blazed up my entire arm, and I would have cried out, I would have crumpled, except a hand caught my elbow from behind and a voice hissed quietly against my ear. "Don't. Ruth." Senior kitchen servant, 63 years old, sharp-tongued and practical, the woman who had taught me which corridors to avoid and which lords to never pour a second drink for. Ruth, who I had known for 3 years and thought I understood completely. Her grip on my elbow was iron. "Breathe," she said. "Keep your face still. Do not look at your arm." "Ruth." "Not here." Her voice was barely sound. "Smile if you can manage it. Then follow me." Slowly. I could not smile, but I could move. I had spent 2 years practicing the particular art of feeling everything and showing nothing, and I spent every lesson of it crossing that room at a servant's unhurried pace, setting my tray on the nearest table as though I simply needed to step out for more wine, and following Ruth through the servants' corridor without looking back. I did not look back. If I had looked back, I might have seen Dorian watching the space where I had been standing. I might have seen his hand at his side. Not holding cashins anymore, the formal moment having passed, curled into a fist so tight his knuckles had gone pale. I might have made different decisions. Instead, I followed Ruth into the back corridor, and when the door closed behind us and the noise of the celebration became muffled and distant, I finally looked at my arm. The crescent mark had changed. It was no longer just the clean curve I had carried for 2 years. Lines were extending from it now, branching outward across my skin in patterns that moved like they were alive, like roots drinking after drought, spreading toward my wrist, toward my shoulder, glowing faintly silver in the dim corridor light. Ruth stared at it. Her face, which had been a study in controlled urgency, went completely still. "Ruth." My voice came out steadier than I deserved. "What is this?" She looked up at me. In 30 years of palace service, Ruth had seen things that would empty a lesser person's expression permanently. She was not a woman who frightened easily. She was frightened. "I've only ever read about this," she said, "in texts that most people think are mythology." She gripped my arm gently, turning it to see the spreading pattern in the light. "Child." Her voice dropped. "I need you to tell me everything about the night you and the king made this mark. Every detail. Leave nothing out." The sounds of celebration drifted through the wall. 400 wolves toasting my replacement. "How long do we have?" I asked. Ruth glanced toward the great hall, then back at me with an expression that made my stomach drop. "Not long enough," she said. "Come with me." Now. Chapter 2. What the Blood Remembers. The chamber beneath the kitchens had no name that anyone used anymore. Ruth moved the third wine barrel from the left. There was a technique to it, a specific angle, the kind of movement that looks accidental until you understand it is precise, and the shelf behind it swung inward on hinges so well-oiled they made no sound at all. The passage beyond was narrow and lit by a single phosphorescent strip of moss that grew along the ceiling, casting everything in pale blue-green light. I had walked past that shelf 1,000 times. I had never known. "How long has this been here?" I asked as Ruth pulled the shelf closed behind us. "Longer than the palace," she said. "Keep moving." The passage opened into a circular chamber perhaps 20 feet across. The walls were carved stone, covered in markings I didn't immediately recognize, not decorative, structural, the kind of inscriptions that mean something specific and have been maintained with purpose. A single table. 2 chairs. Shelves of books so old their spines had lost their titles. And in the center of the table, a flat disc of pale stone with a marking on it that stopped me mid-step. A crescent, branching outward in patterns identical to what was spreading across my arm. "Sit down," Ruth said. "What is?" "Lena." Her voice was not unkind, but it was immovable. "Sit down and let me explain, because we have very little time and a great deal of ground to cover, and the next hour is going to require you to hold several impossible things in your mind simultaneously." I sat. Ruth remained standing. She moved to the shelves with the focused efficiency of someone who knows exactly where everything is and has always known. She pulled a book. Not old, relatively recent, handwritten, and laid it open on the table between us. "The blood moon ceremony you performed with the king 2 years ago," she said. "Tell me exactly what happened." I had not spoken about that night to anyone. Not once. I had carried it in the locked chamber in my chest alongside his name, and it had lived there warm and certain and entirely mine. I told her. The night of the autumn blood moon, Dorian had come to the kitchens at 3 in the morning. Not unusual, he had a habit of sleeplessness that the palace had learned to accommodate. I had been the only one still up. We had talked for 2 hours at the kitchen table about nothing significant, a book he'd been reading, a memory I had of my grandmother's garden, the particular quality of silence in a palace full of people. And then he had looked at me across the table and said, very quietly, I want to show you something. I need you to trust me. He had taken me to the old chapel in the palace's original east wing. Pre-political, pre-hierarchy. The kind of space that predated everything the pack had become. The moon came through the window exactly right, blood red and full, and so present it felt like a third person in the room. He had explained what the ceremony was. Ancient. Binding. Performed only when both wolves chose it with complete awareness of what it meant. Not a political arrangement. Not a contract. A soul declaration, the kind the first alphas used before marriage became strategy. Did you understand what you were agreeing to? Ruth asked. He explained it, I said. He told me it was permanent. And you agreed. I agreed. Ruth was quiet for a moment. Something moved across her face, not judgment. Something more complicated. The binding that ceremony creates, she said, cannot be overwritten by any subsequent arrangement. Not politically. Not legally. Not magically. She met my eyes. In the eyes of the moon goddess and in the biological architecture of your wolves, you and Dorian Voss are mated. Permanently. Whatever he announced tonight in that hall has no validity in any framework that predates pack law. The words should have felt like relief. They felt like the edge of a very high place. Then why? Because pack law doesn't care what the goddess thinks, Ruth said with a bluntness that was almost gentle. Because the Cross family has been engineering this match for 3 years, and they have the political weight to make it real regardless of ancient precedent. Because she stopped. Looked at me carefully. There's something else. Isn't there? It was not a question. I had been carrying the other secret for 6 weeks. Measuring it, circling it, choosing the right moment to speak it aloud and finding every moment wrong for one reason or another. Now I looked at Ruth in the blue-green light of this hidden chamber and understood that the right moment had never been coming. That I had been waiting for permission from a future that was not going to arrive. I'm pregnant, I said. Ruth closed her eyes. When she opened them, they held a weight that hadn't been there 30 seconds earlier. Not horror, something more serious than horror. The expression of someone watching a prophecy begin. How far? 6 weeks. She nodded slowly, as though this confirmed something she had been calculating. She turned pages in the handwritten book until she found what she was looking for, then turned it to face me. The page was filled with diagrams of the branching mark pattern. And beside each diagram, text in a handwriting older than Ruth's annotations. I leaned forward to read it. The words that stopped me. The child of the first blood and the Alpha Royal, carried together in a bound vessel, produces a convergence of gifts unseen since. Ruth. What is the first blood? She took a breath. Your grandmother, she said, was not the simple village healer your mother told you she was. She sat down across from me for the first time since we'd entered the chamber. Something about the act of sitting felt like an acknowledgement that this was going to take time they might not have. She was a keeper of the oldest lineage in pack history. A bloodline that traces directly back to the founding wolves, the ones the moon goddess breathed the first life into. Before hierarchy. Before politics. Before any of what we call civilization. She paused. This lineage appears once every several generations. The wolf it produces doesn't just fight or lead or communicate. It creates. Territories respond to it. Bonds form around it. Living things grow toward it the way plants grow toward light. I was staring at my arm. The branching pattern had quieted to a low glow. Patient. Waiting. My mother suppressed it, I said. Not a question. I felt the truth of it arriving the way you feel weather changing. She knew what it was and she hid it. She was terrified, Ruth said. She'd seen what happened to women who carried power the Alpha Kings hadn't sanctioned. Suppression was the kindest option she had. Her voice softened. The binding ceremony broke the suppression open. 2 years of contact with Dorian's Alpha royal bloodline, and then the moment of the full soul declaration. It was enough to begin waking what had been sleeping in you since birth. And the baby carries both, Ruth said. Your lineage and his. Do you know what the convergence of those two bloodlines has produced, historically, in the 3 documented times it has occurred? I shook my head. Something the pack histories call the bridge, she said quietly. A wolf who exists between the living world and the spirit realm. Who can move between them? Who carries gifts so fundamental they reshape the nature of reality itself for every wolf alive? She held my gaze. The last bridge was born 800 years ago. She remade the boundary between life and death. Wolves live longer because of what she did. Mate bonds are stronger. The healing gifts that healers carry. Those come from her work. The silence in the chamber was absolute. And now, I said, because someone had to say it, there's another one coming. Yes, Ruth said. In 6 weeks' worth of time. Growing, yes. Not arriving for months yet. Ruth reached across the table and covered my hand with hers. Lena, you are not unprotected in this. You are not alone in this. I need you to understand that. There are people who have been watching for this, waiting for this, who will. Footsteps on the stairs above us. Not Ruth's measured tread. Not a servant's unhurried pace. The particular sound of someone who knows exactly where they're going and has decided not to pretend otherwise. Ruth stood. I stood. My hand went instinctively to my stomach, not performance, pure reflex. The shelf door swung inward. Lady Cassioncross stepped into the chamber. She was flanked by 2 guards who stationed themselves at the entrance without being asked. She wore the same winter ice gown. Her copper hair was still perfect. She looked around the chamber with the unhurried interest of someone conducting an inspection they've been meaning to get to, and then her eyes found me and stopped moving. I wondered where you'd gone, she said. Her voice was pleasant. Musical. Carefully assembled. The little attendant the king is inexplicably fond of. I've been curious about you. Ruth moved to stand between us. It was a quiet gesture. Deliberate. Cashin looked at her for the first time. Something crossed her face, not surprise. Calculation. A keeper, she said. I didn't know there were any of you left. She tilted her head. Interesting. She raised one hand. She spoke a word. It was a single syllable in a language I didn't recognize, and it landed in the room like a stone landing in water, a ripple that went outward from Cashin and touched everything. The moss on the ceiling flickered. The candles leaned sideways simultaneously. Ruth crumpled. Not with violence. Her knees simply stopped working, and she went down in a controlled collapse, unconscious before she reached the floor, her expression peaceful, almost like sleep. I moved toward her without thinking. She's fine, Cashin said. She'll wake in an hour with a headache and no memory of the last 20 minutes. Blood magic is precise when you apply it correctly. She stepped further into the room, moving around the table with the careful propriety of someone conducting business. I want you to understand that I'm not here to harm you. I'm here to have a conversation that could have happened several different ways, and I'm choosing the most efficient one. You put her on the floor, I said. My voice was steady. I was distantly impressed by this, the way you notice irrelevant things during catastrophe. I put her to sleep, Cashin corrected. There's a difference, and the distinction matters to me. She stopped on the opposite side of the table. Up close, she was even more beautiful and even less warm. Her eyes were the color of a winter lake, not cold so much as deep, containing things beneath the surface that the surface would not show you. You know what you are now. What your child is. She glanced at my arm. The mark confirms it regardless of what she managed to tell you before I arrived. What do you want? For you to leave, she said simply. Tonight. Before morning. Take whatever you can carry and don't stop moving until you're beyond reach of every pack that holds an alliance with Silver Crown. She paused. I'll give you a 3-day head start. My trackers will find nothing for 72 hours. That's more than enough time to disappear. And if I refuse? The pleasantness in her expression remained perfectly intact. That was the terrifying part. It never moved, never slipped, never revealed anything that could be called feeling. Then I will present the king with evidence, fabricated, but compelling, that his hidden attendant has been conducting espionage against the crown for the past 2 years. Selling pack intelligence to rivals. Manipulating the king's emotional state through omega pheromone conditioning. She spoke the way someone reads from a list they've already memorized. The charges carry a death sentence. Dorian will have no political choice but to sign the order. He won't know he's signing away his mate. He won't know about the child. Her eyes dropped to my stomach. And all of it ends here, tonight, before it becomes the threat it's destined to become. You're afraid of my baby, I said. Something finally moved behind her eyes. Not fear, she was too controlled for fear to show directly. But its shadow. The shape of it. I am afraid of nothing, she said. I am strategic about everything. There is a difference. She straightened. You have until midnight. Leave quietly and everyone in this room lives. Stay and she glanced at Ruth's sleeping form. The next conversation will be considerably less civil. She walked to the door. She paused with her hand on the frame, and for one unguarded moment, she looked back at me with an expression that wasn't the performed pleasantness and wasn't the cold strategy. Something underneath both of them. Something that looked almost human. For what it's worth, she said quietly, I didn't choose this either. Then she was gone. The shelf swung closed. The chamber was silent. I stood in the blue-green light with Ruth unconscious at my feet and my mark burning silver on my arm and a future growing inside me that would reshape the world, and I made the only calculation left available. I did not have much to take. Some clothes. The coins I had saved in 3 years of service. A locket that had belonged to my grandmother. The woman I now understood had been something ancient and extraordinary and deliberately hidden. I packed in 4 minutes. I wrote a letter to Dorian that I folded and put in my pocket. I told myself I would send it from wherever I ended up. Somewhere safe. Somewhere real. I left through the kitchen entrance. The guards were all still at the celebration. No one noticed a servant slipping out into the dark. The question was where to go. Every allied territory was Cashin's reach. Every pack border was a risk I couldn't afford. There was only one place on the map that held no allegiance and made no promises and had been avoided for so long that its geography had become more story than fact. The Thornwood. The ancient forest between territories that belonged to no one. That wolves had been telling their children was haunted for generations. That people who entered were said to not come back. I started walking toward it. I told myself it was survival instinct. Told myself it was the only logical direction remaining. But somewhere beneath the logic, somewhere in the place where the mark burned and the wolf I hadn't known I fully had pressed warm and certain against my ribs, I think I already knew. Something in the Thornwood was waiting for me, and had been for a very long time. Chapter 3. The Territory Between. Running feels different when you have no destination. When you are running towards something, even something uncertain, even something frightening, your body understands the assignment. It organizes itself around a purpose. But running away from everything you have ever known, with nowhere specific ahead and nothing safe behind, produces a different kind of movement entirely. Less like running. More like falling forward and catching yourself. Again and again and again. I had been falling forward for 3 hours. The palace lights had disappeared behind the tree line long before I stopped looking back. The outer pack roads gave way to forest paths, and the forest paths thinned to animal trails, and the animal trails eventually dissolved into underbrush that grabbed at my ankles and made every step a negotiation. My bag was light. I had packed practically, not sentimentally, but my legs were not built for this. 2 years of corridor service and kitchen work had not prepared me for cross-country movement in the dark. My mark lit the way. That was the strange thing. The branching pattern on my arm glowed faintly silver in the darkness, not enough to betray me to anyone at distance, but enough that I could see the ground immediately ahead. Enough that I could place my feet without stumbling into the worst of the undergrowth. It was purposeful, that light. Directed. As though the mark itself knew where I was going even when I didn't. I thought about Dorian. I tried not to, but the thoughts came anyway in the particular way of things you have spent years carefully managing. The moment your discipline cracks even slightly, they pour through the gap. I thought about the way he had looked in the Great Hall before the announcement. The tiredness in him that had nothing to do with sleep. I thought about the 1 second our eyes had met. That single second that had contained something I couldn't name, complicated and shadowed, and for one disorienting moment, almost desperate. I thought about the Blood Moon Chapel. The way the red light had come through the window and turned everything the color of something ancient. The way he had explained the ceremony with a seriousness that hadn't felt like formality. The way he had looked at me afterward, with the particular expression of a man who has done something irreversible and found he does not regret it. I want to show you something. I need you to trust me. I had trusted him. The letter in my pocket felt like a stone. Folded tight, addressed in my own handwriting to a name I had never been allowed to use publicly. I was still telling myself I would send it from wherever I ended up. I was becoming less convinced that wherever existed. The Allied territories were Cashin's reach. I had already accepted that. Every pack that bordered Silver Crown held political debt to the House of Voss or the House of Cross or both. Returning to my home village meant leading everything that was hunting me directly to my grandmother's door, and I would not do that. I would not purchase my safety with hers. Which left the Thornwood. The border appeared without announcement. No signpost, no formal marker, just a place where the regular forest ended and something else began. The change was atmospheric more than physical. The trees on this side of the line were the same species as the trees behind me. The ground was the same ground. But the quality of the darkness shifted, deepened, became a different kind of quiet. The silence in the Thornwood was not the silence of a place where nothing lived. It was the silence of a place that was listening. I stood at the border for a long moment. Every story I had ever heard about this forest arranged itself helpfully in my memory. Wolves who entered and didn't return. Hunters who came out 3 days later unable to speak about what they'd seen. Children told for generations that the Thornwood was where the dead went when the spirit realm didn't want them anymore. My mark pulsed once. Warm and certain. Toward the trees. Right then, I said to no one and stepped across the line. The cold came first, not temperature, something older than temperature. A pressure against the chest that felt like being recognized. Like walking into a room where everyone already knows your name. My wolf, which had been pressed warm and anxious against my ribs for hours, went suddenly still. Not frightened. Attentive. The way an animal goes still when it hears its own name called. I walked. The Thornwood floor was soft. Centuries of accumulated leaves, undisturbed, springy underfoot in a way that felt almost considerate. The trees here had grown into shapes that were less random than intentional, their branches interlocking overhead in patterns that filtered the moonlight into something directional. Not blocking the path. Framing it. I had been walking for perhaps 20 minutes when my legs decided they were finished. It was not a gradual decline. One moment I was moving. The next my knees had simply stopped participating in the arrangement, and I went down onto the forest floor with a gracelessness that would have embarrassed me if there had been anyone to witness it. I sat in the dark and pressed both hands over my stomach and tried to remember how to breathe correctly. The mark blazed. Not pain, the opposite of pain. A warmth so complete it bordered on disorienting, spreading outward from my arm through my chest, through my entire body, like being submerged in something that existed specifically to sustain you. I had never felt it like this before. The 2 years I had carried it, it had been background warmth, a steady companion. This was active, communicative, something reaching out from inside me and calling. And then an answer. Not sound. Not light. Sensation. A pulse from somewhere ahead of me in the darkness, answering the pulse from my arm. Back and forth, back and forth. A conversation in a language that predated words. I lifted my eyes. A girl stood 3 feet in front of me. 10 years old, perhaps. Bare feet on the cold ground. Simple clothing. Silver-white hair that caught the moonlight and threw it back like she was made of it. And eyes silver, completely silver, the kind of eyes that have seen more than 10 years of living should allow. She was watching me with her head tilted to one side. The expression on her face was not surprise. It was not caution. It was the specific expression of someone who has been waiting for a thing to happen and is now watching it happen and feels confirmed. "You have the old mark," she said. Her voice was a child's voice, clear, unguarded, but the words carried the weight of something far older. "Mother said someone would come eventually." She glanced down at my arm where the silver light still pulsed. "I've been watching the border for 2 years. Who is your mother?" I managed. The girl tilted her head further. "She'll tell you herself." She stood and held out her hand with the matter-of-fact confidence of a child who has never had reason to doubt that the world will respond correctly to her gestures. "Come on." Before his trackers reached the tree line. "Whose trackers?" "All of them," she said. "You have about 4 minutes." I took her hand. She walked without hesitation through the Thornwood, navigating by some internal compass I couldn't perceive, leading me through passages between trees that grew incrementally wider until we reached what appeared to be a sheer rock face. A cliff rising straight out of the forest floor, solid and absolute. The girl placed her free hand flat against the stone. The rock didn't move. The air around it moved. A shimmer, like heat over summer roads, rippled outward from her palm, and then the rock face was still there, but also somehow not a glamour I understood. A concealment so well constructed that looking at it directly was meaningless. What mattered was knowing where the opening was. She walked through the cliff face. I walked through the cliff face. On the other side was a valley. Firelight. Real, warm, amber firelight from a dozen sources. Structures built between and around, and with the living trees, not cutting them, incorporating them, the kind of building that happens when people have lived somewhere long enough to negotiate with the landscape rather than impose on it. Paths between the structures, worn smooth by long use. The smell of food. The sound of water. And people. Wolves, moving through the space with the quiet confidence of those who are exactly where they belong. A woman stood at the valley entrance. She was perhaps 50, with the kind of physical presence that has nothing to do with size. She held herself with a stillness that was not passivity, but absolute groundedness, the bearing of someone who has not needed to prove anything to anyone in a very long time. Her hair was dark, streaked with silver, cut practical and short. Her eyes, when they found mine, held a recognition so immediate and so complete that my feet stopped moving of their own accord. She looked at me the way you look at someone you have been constructing in your imagination for years and are now measuring against the reality. "I've been waiting 6 years for you," she said. Her voice was warm and serious in equal measure. I was starting to wonder if the binding had chosen wrong. But the mark doesn't lie, and neither does the blood. She stepped forward and extended her hand, not the gesture of a host greeting a guest, but something more formal, more weighted. "My name is Vesper. I lead the wolves of this valley." She held my gaze. "And I think it's time you learned what your grandmother really was." The girl with silver eyes slipped past both of us into the valley without a backward glance. I looked at Vesper's outstretched hand, at the firelight beyond her, at the people moving through the warm living space of a community that had been here, quietly and completely, while the world outside told stories about haunted forests and wolves who didn't come back. They hadn't come back because they'd found something worth staying for. I took Vesper's hand. "Tell me everything," I said. Chapter 4: The Valley of Unbroken Wolves. I slept for 14 hours. I did not intend to. I sat down on the bed in the small clean room Vesper's people showed me to and told myself I would rest for an hour, just an hour, and then I would ask my questions and make my plans and do all the things that needed doing. Instead, my body made a unilateral decision, the way bodies do when they have been running on fear and adrenaline for so long that the moment safety arrives, the entire system simply stops negotiating. I woke to winter light coming through a gap in the wooden walls. Amber and slanted, the kind of light that means mid-morning. Someone had left food on the small table beside my bed, bread, soft cheese, something hot in a clay cup that smelled of ginger and honey, and placed a knitted blanket over me that I had no memory of pulling around myself. I lay still for a moment, listening. Outside the room, the sounds of a working community. Voices, movement, the specific clatter of multiple lives being lived in proximity. Children somewhere, their laughter distinct and unguarded, the kind of sound that doesn't happen in places where people are afraid. I pressed both hands to my stomach. Still there. Still growing. Still the most consequential secret in several hundred years of pack history, quietly and stubbornly continuing regardless of everything happening around it. You're awake. Vesper stood in the doorway. She moved without announcement, not intrusively, just with the ease of someone for whom space is not a performance. She carried a chair from somewhere in the corridor and set it beside my bed with the settled intention of a woman who has a great deal to say and intends to say all of it. Eat first, she said. What I'm about to tell you will be easier to hold if you're not hungry. I ate. She waited. Neither of us pretended this was small talk. When the bread was gone and the cup was warm in my hands, Vesper leaned forward with her elbows on her knees and began. Your grandmother's name was Lena Ashford. She was born 63 years ago in a village 3 days' travel north of Silver Crown territory. A place so small and unremarkable that it appears on no official pack map, which was precisely the point. Vesper's voice carried the particular cadence of someone recounting something they have studied until it became personal. She was the only child of a woman named Covenant, who was herself the only child of a woman named Sable. And Sable was the last documented carrier of what the oldest pack texts call the First Blood. Ruth mentioned that, I said. She said it traced back to the founding wolves. It does. Vesper nodded. Before hierarchy. Before politics. Before the Alpha King structure calcified into what it is now, there were the first wolves. 13 of them, according to the oldest accounts. The moon goddess breathed them directly into being, each one carrying a specific gift, a specific purpose. Most of those original bloodlines have diluted over centuries to the point of invisibility. Natural dilution, mating across generations. But one line maintains something essential. She paused. The line that carries the creation gift. The ability to not just exist within the world the goddess made, but to participate in its maintenance. To strengthen bonds. To heal what has been torn. To grow new life in dead places. I looked at my arm. The branching pattern was quiet this morning, present, warm, but resting. Your grandmother knew what she was, Vesper continued. She spent most of her life hiding it for the same reason women always hide power that inconveniences the people in charge of things. She found a quiet life. She was careful. And when your mother was born with the same gift emerging, Isla made a decision that she believed was protection. She suppressed it, I said. She suppressed it, Vesper confirmed. Herbal binding, maintained from birth. An old technique that the keepers documented but never endorsed. It was always considered a last resort, something you did when the alternative was execution. Her voice softened fractionally. Your mother grew up without knowing what she carried, without knowing what she was. Isla told herself she would explain when the time was right, that she would find a safe way to pass the knowledge on. But she didn't. She didn't have the chance. She died when you were 11. And Isla, your grandmother, was by then too frightened of what would happen if she told you without a structure in place to protect you. Vesper met my eyes steadily. So the suppression passed to you through the bloodline, maintained without you even knowing it was there. And you grew up thinking you were simply a wolf of ordinary gifts. I grew up thinking I was a wolf of ordinary gifts, I repeated. I spent 24 years believing. I stopped. Breathed. The blood moon ceremony broke it open. The soul binding ceremony generates an enormous amount of the specific energy that activates first blood gifts, Vesper said. 2 years of gradual contact with a complementary royal bloodline, building toward that moment, it was enough to begin unwinding what Isla constructed. She paused. And the pregnancy accelerated everything. The child's gifts are already interacting with yours. What you felt last night, the blazing of the mark, the warmth, the instinctive navigation. That wasn't just you. That was both of you. I set down the clay cup because my hands were no longer steady enough to hold it. Tell me about the bridge, I said. Tell me what my child is going to be. Vesper was quiet for a moment. Not hesitating, organizing. The way you organize before saying something that deserves to be said correctly. 800 years ago, she said, a woman named Solen carried the same convergence you carry now. First blood and alpha royal, bound in the old way, a child conceived under the blood moon. She stood and moved to the window, looking out at the valley below where her wolves moved through their morning routines. The child she bore was called the bridge because that is literally what she was, a point of connection between the living world and the spirit realm that the moon goddess inhabits. She could move between them, speak to both sides, carry knowledge and healing from one into the other. You said wolves live longer because of her. She remade the boundary between life and death, strengthened it in ways that reduce the toll of passing. The healing gifts that every pack healer carries today, those are her inheritance. The strength of mate bonds. The way a dying wolf can sometimes hold on longer than should be physically possible when their mate is present. Vesper turned from the window. All of that came from one woman who was born from exactly the convergence you're carrying. The weight of it settled over me gradually, the way real things settle, not with the immediate crash of shock, but with the slower, heavier accumulation of comprehension. I'm frightened, I said. Because it was true, and Ruth had told me once that naming true things accurately was the beginning of handling them. Good, Vesper said. Frightened means you understand the magnitude. Frightened is appropriate. She moved back to her chair. What frightened is not is a reason to run from it. Your grandmother ran. Your mother never had the chance to choose. She held my gaze. You have the opportunity to do something neither of them could. To stand inside what you are instead of away from it. A knock at the door. A young woman stepped in. Maya, I would learn, the valley's intelligence keeper, with quick dark eyes and the compressed energy of someone perpetually processing more information than she has hands for. She looked at Vesper with an expression that carried news. The Silver Crown Pack, she said. One of our outside contacts just sent word. Dorian, I said. Not a question. Maya glanced at me. He hasn't made a public appearance since the night of the engagement announcement. Dismissed his entire council. Locked himself in his private chambers. She paused. He's issued one directive. Unofficial, not through any formal channel. Privately, to 3 trackers he trusts personally. My chest tightened. Find Lena, I said. Find Lena, Maya confirmed. She hesitated. There's something else. Cashin's private trackers are also moving. They're working separately from any official Silver Crown operation, her own people, loyal to the Cross family rather than the pack. They have a different objective. They're not looking for me to bring me back, I said. No. The fire in the small hearth crackled. Outside, a child laughed at something. He doesn't know, I said quietly. Dorian doesn't know about the pregnancy. He doesn't know what I am. I stopped. He's looking because the binding was real. Because his wolf, even if everything else about him was layered in politics and obligation and Cashin's careful manufactured dependency. His wolf had felt the same soul declaration I had felt in that chapel 2 years ago. And whatever Cashin had done to manage the space between then and now, she had not been able to fully sever something that old, that fundamental, that absolute. He was looking. And somewhere in the Thornwood behind us, 2 separate sets of trackers were looking too. Silver, Vesper said. The girl appeared in the doorway as though she'd been standing just outside it. Her silver eyes were slightly unfocused. That particular distant expression I was already learning to read. She's coming, Silver said. Her voice was the flat, certain tone of someone reporting a fact rather than predicting a possibility. 3 days. He'll find the old border path, the one that isn't on any map. Her eyes cleared and she looked directly at me with the unnerving directness of a child who has not yet learned to soften information. He's carrying your letter. The one you never sent. The room went very quiet. That's not possible, I said. The letter is in my pocket. I've had it since I reached into my coat. My fingers found folded paper. But the paper felt different. Lighter. I pulled it out. The fold was the same. The handwriting on the outside, his name, in my hand, was the same. The inside was empty. Not blank empty. As though the words had been present and then transferred to somewhere else. as though the letter had delivered itself without my knowledge or permission while I slept. Silver watched me process this with the patience of someone for whom impossible things are a regular occurrence. "The mark," Vesper said softly. "The first blood doesn't just respond to the world. It acts in it, even when you're not consciously directing it." I looked at the empty paper in my hands, at the branching pattern on my arm, quietly luminous in the morning light. My wolf pressed warm and certain against my ribs. 3 days. Chapter 5, What We Broke and What Remains. He arrived on the 3rd day at dusk. I knew before Silver announced it. The mark blazed an hour before he reached the valley entrance, not the urgent flare of danger, but something more complicated. The particular warmth of something that has been traveling toward you for a very long time finally entering range. I told Vesper I would meet him at the border. She didn't argue. She simply looked at me for a moment with those steady eyes that had seen more history than I could calculate, and said, "Whatever you decide in that field, I will stand behind it." I walked out through the glamoured cliff face alone. The Thornwood at dusk was different from the Thornwood at night, softer, the light filtering through the canopy in long amber columns, the silence less weighted and more simply quiet. I stood at the tree line that bordered the valley entrance and watched him emerge from the forest. Dorian Voss looked nothing like himself. The Alpha King who had stood on the dais in the great hall in his ceremonial finery had been constructed, arranged, managed, performed. The man who walked out of the Thornwood toward me had been none of those things. He had been 3 days in these woods alone, without ceremony or protocol or the elaborate architecture of kingship. His clothes were travel-worn, his dark hair disheveled, his jaw unshaved. He moved with the particular exhaustion of a body that has pushed past its reasonable limits on the fuel of pure determination. He stopped when he saw me. We stood 20 feet apart in the amber evening light and looked at each other across everything that had happened. He spoke first. "I don't have a speech," he said. His voice was rough from 3 days of minimal use and something deeper than that. I rehearsed things to say on the walk here, and every version of it sounded like a man trying to defend the indefensible. "So I'm not going to do that." "Then what are you going to do?" I asked. "Tell you the truth." He took one step forward and then stopped, as though he understood that closing the distance between us was something that required permission rather than assumption. The night of the announcement, I walked out of that ceremony, and I couldn't remember agreeing to it. I could remember the weeks of preparation. I could remember conversations and meetings and logistics. But the moment of choosing, the moment where I would have said, "Yes, I want this," I couldn't find it. His jaw worked. I went back through every memory I had of the engagement process, and there was a quality to all of it. Like something recalled through glass. Like watching myself do things from a distance. "Cashin's witch," I said. Something shifted in his expression. "You know," Ruth told me, before Cashin put her to sleep in a basement. His hands curled at his sides. "Is she?" "She's fine. She's here." I watched him absorb this. "How long, Dorian? How long do you think it had been going on?" He was quiet for a moment. The honest kind of quiet, not evasion, but the difficulty of measuring something you've only just been able to see. "The Cross family introduced Cashin to court 8 months before the announcement," he said. "The fog started before that. Subtle at first, I thought it was the weight of the kingship. The ordinary exhaustion of leadership. It was only after it lifted he stopped." "When did it lift?" "The morning after you disappeared." The words landed between us. I let them. "I reached for you," he said, and his voice dropped to something stripped of all performance. "I wasn't fully awake yet. It was pure reflex, 2 years of reaching for you in the morning and expecting you to be there. And you weren't. And the absence of you hit me before I was even conscious enough to remember why." He finally took the second step forward. And it was like the fog had a crack in it. Just a crack. Just enough to look through and see what was on the other side. And what was on the other side? "You," he said simply. "Just you." What I'd chosen before anyone started choosing for me. I had prepared for this conversation. I had spent 3 days in the valley preparing. Talking to Vesper, talking to the women here who had their own versions of this story, their own iterations of men who had explanations that sounded reasonable and turned out to be elaborate excuses. I had built careful architecture around my heart. Measured, considered, protected. The architecture held. But underneath it, my wolf pressed warm and absolutely certain against my ribs, and the mark on my arm pulsed once, and I understood that holding and healing were going to have to exist simultaneously. That I could believe him, truly believe him, the way the binding insisted I believe the essential truth of what he was saying, and still require something more than words. I need proof, I said. Not of the magic. I believe you about the magic. I need proof of you. Of what you'll actually do when the choice is visible and real and costs something. He looked at me steadily. Tell me what that looks like. I don't know yet, I said honestly. But you'll know it when it arrives. Something moved across his face, not the complicated shadowed expression from the Great Hall. Something cleaner. The expression of a man who has stopped managing and started simply existing in whatever truth is available. He reached out his hand. Not grabbing. Not claiming. Offering. The mark on my arm blazed silver. And on his wrist, in a place I had never seen, had never noticed in 2 years of knowing him, an answering mark appeared. Burning through his skin from the inside, branching outward in patterns that mirrored mine exactly, mirror image to mirror image, like two halves of a sentence. He looked at his wrist. Then at me. That's been there this whole time, I said softly. Hasn't it? I thought it was a scar, he said. I thought it was, he stopped. 2 years. I've had this for 2 years and I thought it was a scar. From somewhere at the valley entrance behind me, I heard Vesper make a sound, quiet, involuntary. The sound of someone witnessing something they had read about in books and not entirely expected to see in their lifetime. A dual manifestation, she said softly. Both marks present, both active, both responding simultaneously. A pause. The binding is complete. There's no magical or political mechanism that can touch this. Dorian's eyes were still on mine. And then Silver's voice, sharp and immediate, from the valley rim above us. They're here. Through the tree line at the valley's far edge movement. Organized, deliberate, the particular quality of motion that means trained military rather than civilian. I counted quickly 30 wolves, perhaps more behind the first rank. Wearing no pack insignia. Cashin's private force. And at their center, a figure I could feel from 200 meters away. The witch. She was a small woman, unremarkable to look at, which was presumably intentional. But the cold she carried moved ahead of her like a season. A presence like a hand closing around something vital. My wolf snarled, deep and involuntary, and I felt the mark on my arm shift from warmth to something sharper, more active, more aware. Cashin walked out from among her wolves. She was still impeccable. Still perfectly arranged, still wearing the pleasant neutrality of a woman who has decided how things end. But there were edges to her now that the Great Hall performance had concealed. The 3 days since the announcement had cost her something. She was not quite as composed as she wanted to appear. She looked at Dorian. Come home, she said. Her voice carried the honey tone, warm, reasonable, the voice that had presumably done a great deal of work over the past 8 months. Whatever she's shown you here, whatever she's told you, you know what Omegas are capable of when they want to trap an alpha. Whatever you think you feel. Stop. Dorian's voice was quiet. Absolutely quiet, the kind of quiet that doesn't need volume because it carries something more fundamental than volume. He said one word and Cashin's carefully constructed sentence simply ceased. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he shifted. Right there, in the field between the valley and the tree line, with 30 armed wolves watching and the witch's cold presence pressing against everything. His wolf erupted from him, massive and dark, almost black in the dusk light, a wolf that carried 600 years of alpha royal bloodline in every line of its body. Enormous. Certain. And absolutely magnificent. It turned its back on Cashin. Walked to my side. Pressed its flank against my leg with the unhurried deliberateness of a choice that requires no announcement because it is simply the truth made visible. The field went completely still. Cashin's pleasant expression cracked. What came through the crack was not the cold strategy one had seen in the basement chamber. It was something rawer than that. Pain, I realized. Actual pain, not because she loved Dorian. I didn't believe that. Because she had built something and invested something and been promised something, and it was dissolving in front of her in a field at dusk. "You're making a mistake," she said. The wolf at my leg turned its head and looked at her. Then Cassion's witch raised her hands. The cold hit me like a wall, not physical, but aimed directly at my mark, at the branching pattern, at the thing growing inside me. The witch had encountered this power before. She knew what she was reaching for. Her magic was precise and practiced, and she sent it like a blade toward the most vulnerable point. My wolf did not flinch. Something woke up in me that had no name I had been given for it yet. Not fury. Fury requires friction. This was something older than friction. Something that remembered being present before fury existed, before conflict existed, before any of the arrangements that produce conflict existed. I stepped forward. The witch's magic hit my mark and stopped. Not deflected. Not blocked. Simply stopped, the way a river stops when it reaches the ocean. Not overcome, absorbed. Taken in. Unmade at its source. I looked at the witch across the dark field, and what came out of me was not aggressive, not threatening, not even particularly loud. "No," I said. The word resonated. I felt it leave me and travel, not just across the field, but outward, in the way the children's howl had traveled in the story Ruth had told me about ancient times. Through the Thornwood. Through the territory. Into the spaces between things where power lives. The witch's magic collapsed. She took 3 stumbling steps backward. The cold she carried dissipated, not dramatically, just suddenly absent, like a sound cut off mid-note. She looked at her own hands with an expression I recognized. The expression of someone discovering that the tool they have relied on no longer functions. Cassion's wolves moved back. Not in rout. In the instinctive, involuntary way that wolves move when something registers as fundamentally greater than themselves. Ancient recognition. The kind that operates below decision-making. Cassion stood alone in the field. Dorian had shifted back to human form beside me. His hand found mine, not possessively, carefully, a question rather than a statement. I let him hold it. I looked at Cassion across the distance, and saw what I had seen for one unguarded moment in the basement chamber. Underneath the performance, underneath the strategy, underneath everything she had constructed and deployed and maintained exhaustion. The exhaustion of someone who has been fighting very hard for a very long time for something that was never actually what they needed. "What did they promise you?" I asked. The question surprised her. I could see it, the slight widening of composure before she caught it. "What? You told me in the basement that you didn't choose this either. That you'd been promised something." I held her gaze. What was it? A long silence. Around us, both groups of wolves had gone still. Vesper's people at the valley entrance, Cassion's wolves at the tree line, everyone suspended in the particular attention of a moment that is deciding what kind of story it wants to be. "Safety," Cassion said finally. The word came out scraped clean of everything that had been decorating it. My family's safety. My brother. He's an Omega, the only Omega in 4 generations of our bloodline. My parents were going to, she stopped. Swallowed. The Cross family doesn't tolerate weakness. That's what they call him. That's what they've always called him. When the witch came to us with the offer, she said she could ensure his standing. Ensure no one would touch him. All I had to do was secure the Voss alliance. The field breathed. "Is he safe now?" I asked. "Your brother." "I don't know," she said. And it was the most honest thing I had heard from her. With the alliance failed. "Then come inside," I said. Vesper made a sound behind me. Not protest, something between surprise and recognition. "You heard me," I said. I looked at Cassion. "The Vale, this valley, these people, we exist because the world outside keeps producing women with nowhere to go. And men," I added, "and anyone the pack hierarchy decides is inconvenient." I looked at the witch at the tree line. "All of you. Whatever you were promised, whatever you were used for, you have a choice now. Stay out there with whatever remains of an arrangement that's over, or come in here and start something different." The witch looked at me with an expression I would spend years learning to read, the particular expression of a person who has been weaponized for so long that being offered an alternative registers as a threat before it registers as a gift. Why? Cashin said. Would you do that? Because you said you didn't choose this either, I said. I believe you. And because my child, I pressed my free hand to my stomach. My child is going to live in the world you and I and everyone else build between now and her birth. I'd rather she inherit something worth having. Dorian's hand tightened on mine. Cashin looked at me for a long moment. Then at Dorian. Then at the valley behind me where firelight was beginning to glow warm and amber against the deepening dusk. She took one step forward. Then another. Then, with the slightly stunned movement of someone whose body is making a decision before her mind has confirmed it, she walked across the field and through the valley entrance. Her wolves followed. One by one, then in groups, then all of them. The witch was last. She passed me close enough that I could have touched her. She looked at my mark and something in her expression shifted. Not warmth, not yet, but the beginning of a door that had been sealed for a long time standing fractionally open. Then we were all inside. Epilogue: What grows in dead places. My daughter was born in the valley on the night of the spring blood moon. She came into the world quietly, nothing like the thunder and starfire and seismic declarations I had half expected from a child the texts called the bridge. She arrived small and deliberate, with dark hair and her father's jaw and eyes that opened and looked at me with a clarity that no newborn should possess, and yet felt entirely correct. Vesper stood at my left. Dorian at my right, his hand in mine, his eyes bright with something that had no words sufficient for it. Hello, I said to my daughter. I know you've been a long time coming. She blinked, turned her head fractionally toward her father's voice when he said her name, the name we had chosen together in the weeks between the battle in the field and this moment, in the slow, careful work of two people learning to build something new from the salvaged materials of what they had broken. Solen, Dorian said softly, honoring the woman who had come before. Welcome home. In the valley outside, the wolves of the Thornwood refuge gathered without being summoned. Vesper's people, Cashin's people, the ones who had come since, the ones who had come after 400 lives arranged around a central fire, waiting with the particular patience of those who understand that some arrivals are worth waiting for. Silver sat at the valley rim with her legs dangling over the edge, watching the sky. Her silver eyes moved in the way they moved when she was seeing something the rest of us couldn't, futures branching and converging, the river of what might be. She smiled. The small, private smile of someone who has been watching a specific future approach for a long time and is satisfied to see it arrive. In the dead earth beside the valley entrance, in the place where Cashin's witch had struck and been turned back and then walked through under her own power, a flower was growing. White petals. Silver center. The kind that hadn't been seen in this part of the world for 800 years. By morning there were 3. By the end of the week, the entire dead stretch of ground at the valley entrance was covered in them. A carpet of white and silver spreading outward into the Thornwood, following the path I had walked 3 weeks ago in the dark, marking the route from the life I had fled to the life I was building. My grandmother had suppressed what she was. My mother had never known what she carried. I had spent 24 years believing I was ordinary. My daughter opened her eyes on her first morning in the world, and the crystals in the valley ceiling blazed with a light so complete and warm that every wolf in the community woke from sleep simultaneously, blinking, reaching for their mates, checking on their children, feeling in their bones the particular sensation of something fundamentally right having occurred. Dorian was beside me. Not as a king, not with a crown or a title or the architecture of everything he represented. Simply as a man who had found his way through 3 days of forest and decades of fog to the place he should have been all along. What do we do now? He asked. I looked at our daughter. At the light. At the flowers spreading through the dead earth outside. Now, I said, we let her grow.